Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Oakley, managing partner at Oxbow, and I'm excited today to have Arjun Murti. I've always wanted to talk to Arjun. Over the last few years, I watch everything he does and listen to him, and I would say in the energy sector, he is the most interesting person I ever listened to. But Arjun, I want to thank you for being here.
That it's a real pleasure, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today.
Well, I know your company, your partner at Veriton, and your obviously your podcast, and we'll put that on at the end, is Super Spiked and YouTube. It's very interesting to listen to anybody in the energy business. But I'm going to start out by asking you, the energy business obviously in the last 5 years has had transitions up and back. And tell us where you think we are now.
I feel a lot of optimism in terms of where we are now. In fact, we're going to start calling it the return or the rise of energy pragmatism. But, you mentioned my sort of podcast, and it's also in part a written post and blog. And, my analyst career was the first 22 years of my life on Wall Street after graduating. And I stopped in 2014, and I've been doing board and advisory work and was really enjoying that and minding my own business and staying engaged with the sector, but having a good balance. And it really was the last 5 years. 2018, 2019 is when we first saw this concept of net zero, of Paris-aligned targets. And it took on a life of its own in 2021 with everyone has to be net zero immediately, more or less. And there was no part of that sort of, quote, energy transition narrative that I thought made sense. And it's why I've started writing and podcasting. I do it in part, I felt an obligation. If I know something about energy, doesn't mean I'm right, but let me at least give my perspectives. And I feel some sense of optimism and frankly, it's gratifying to see the world starting to normalize towards what I'm going to call a more pragmatic outlook that I think we're in here in 2025.
Well, I think the thing that you talk about the most over the last year and a half is that it wasn't going to happen. And I would say this, you're open to over the next few decades, transitions in energy and everything. It wasn't that you didn't have an open mind. It was that, hey, you can't have a drop dead date tomorrow and make it work. I think that's the way you feel about it.
I think that's exactly right. And so our priority and our focus has been on how do you get everyone to enjoy the kind of lifestyles that you, Ted, myself, my family, all of us here in America, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, a handful of countries, the lucky 1 billion, as I call it, that we get to take for granted. And we use disproportionately more energy than the other 7 billion people on Earth. So most of our focus has been on there isn't anyone in any country that solves for CO2 first. I'm not saying we should or should not solve for it. I think we do have to care about environmental and climate perspectives, but you got to start with how you're going to meet the world's energy needs. And the idea that all the new stuff was going to be ready for prime time in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And at the same time, we're going to aggressively try and retire or disincentivize the old stuff. But mind you, only in friendly countries, the United States, Europe, and Canada, none of that made sense. So to meet the world's energy needs, we're going to need a whole bunch of oil, gas, and frankly, coal is going to be part of the mix, but we're also going to need nuclear. And when you go through the outlooks of the other countries, they're going to want a whole bunch of the new stuff. So I think you said it very correctly. Not only are we not against the new stuff, we spend a lot of time thinking about it and analyzing it, but we also have to be realistic about the S-curves and timeframes by which it can become economic. And it's going to take more time than I think the net zero optimist would have led you to believe. So,
and Arjun, I might ask you this too. Don't you think most people are not aware of how many countries in the world that couldn't operate on electricity anyway? They have to have fossil fuel.
Well, that's a big part of it. And so the false narratives I think we've seen over the last 5 years have centered on a couple things. One, we should aggressively reduce fossil fuels. At the same time, we're ramping renewables. And again, I think solar is actually going to have a big part to play in a bunch of developing countries who are not blessed with a lot of oil, they may not even have coal, and they're going to want some domestic power, if you will. But the idea that that could be 100% of your electricity mix, especially when your starting point is very low, that never made sense. And how much of your power grid do you want to be from intermittent or non-dispatchable power in the absence of long duration battery storage and all the things you'd need to kind of firm up that temporary power, if you want to call it that? That was always a challenge, as is the idea that somehow we should, quote, electrify everything when we know electricity can't be stored, grids are challenged in our country, it's challenged in the places we live, never mind India, China, and the other parts of the developing world. So again, there's a lot of sort of false narratives about the kind of steps you'd want to take to have a healthy energy environment.
So, Arjun, if you take the U.S., I'll take the U.S. oil companies at $72 a barrel, let's say on West Texas Intermediate crude. Do you see that as sort of that a level that drill baby drill would actually work, or does it have to be at a higher price?
You know, it's a catchy slogan. It probably isn't one I would have come up with, but then again, I'm a Wall Street analyst, not a politician, so I think that's a positive thing. I like it as a slogan if the alternative is we want to shut you down and you need to go away. If that was the alternative, I will absolutely take drill, baby, drill. You know, it's always a Rorschach test with President Trump's slogans. To me, it means oil and gas should be part of the mix, and we should encourage investment when it's needed. Practically speaking, I don't think companies are going to be significantly ramping up drilling just because the new administration has come in place. And quite frankly, for the last 10 to 15 years, we have been drilling, baby, and drilling. We've gone from, you know, 0 to 10, 12 million barrels a day of growth in our overall liquids production. So we've kind of done it. And natural gas has gone from 0 LNG exports essentially to be now number one, just ahead of Qatar in 2023 and likely 2024. So we have drill, baby, drill. What we really need to do now is build, baby, build, meaning energy and power infrastructure is what our country needs. But I will say Canada and Europe specifically ought to adopt President Trump's slogan of drill, baby, drill. We need healthy oil and gas industries and friendly allies as well. And frankly, they could all do more on that front.
And I know you've spoken about Canada, that they really have a lot of resources that they could tap into. Do you think they will?
You know, there's been a lot of controversy in Canada, and they've been very upset about the tariff proclamations from the Trump administration. And whatever one thinks about tariffs, and whatever one thinks about whether we should do them or not do them, or how effective they're going to be or not, it has been unifying to Canadians as best as I can tell, left and right politically. And it seems like essentially all Canadians took a lot of offense to the way the tariff threats, if you want to call it that, were made. And if that can embolden Canada to have its federal government and the folks that don't live in the province of Alberta, which of course is the equivalent of the Texas of Canada, if you will, where most of the oil and gas is, if that can get folks aligned to Canada getting incentives to drill, baby, drill, and to build out export infrastructure to the west, to the east, maybe even to the south, still to the US, I think is going to be a very good thing for Canada. In a world where shale is maturing, and I think it can still grow, but it's maturing, the world needs, America needs a healthy and vibrant Canadian oil and gas sector.
So if I switch to natural gas, Arjun, and you might tie this into what the utilities need, but how do you see the natural gas market?
We've generally had a constructive view of natural gas demand and its critical need and I want to be clear, I view natural gas as an important fuel for the future to meet the world's energy needs. I think the oil and gas industry is guilty of buying into, quote, transition fuel narrative. Transition to what? You know, solar and wind will always be intermittent. It's going to be part of the mix. Nuclear is never going to be 90% of power generation like it is in France. So I think natural gas, yes, sir.
Hydrogen and carbon capture, a lot of things.
Hydrogen is honestly probably the most ridiculous of the new stuff. So I actually do like solar. I think there's an important niche for it, especially in the developing world. With places like India and Africa, they get a lot of sun. But hydrogen, come on. You're going to use energy to make more energy and convert it back. You know, so I think natural gas can be very important. But where I would maybe pause a little bit is to say, we have a lot of natural gas resource here in the United States, a lot of natural gas resource in Canada. So I hope none of your viewers will view being optimistic on gas with me making a natural gas price call. We're not doing that. What we're saying is it might be infrastructure, it might be LNG, it could be terminals, it could be a whole bunch of different things. That is what is interesting from the natural gas value chain. It is global, it is also domestic in Canada. And so I think one has to think through where can you optimize your investment opportunities. But I do think natural gas is going to grow pretty majorly over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and it's a critical future fuel.
Do you see on the natural gas side, do you see LNG shipments continuing to grow over that time?
I do. So I think the US growth, again, we've gone from essentially nothing in 2015 to now just passing Qatar as the largest LNG exporter in the world. And that is on track to about double, by 2030. And I think, President Biden had this very unfortunate, permit pause, if you will. I think the reality is a whole bunch of projects were going to be moving forward regardless. They already had the permits. I think what is nice now is now we're not arbitrarily capping the upside, and we'll see what markets demand, but we are on track, meaning the United States, to really dominate LNG exports. To me, the big question is, will all that's going on in Canada motivate them to have the kind of ramp we have? They're not on track to be anywhere near as aggressive, but LNG Canada is kind of a new project that is their first real export opportunity. And I think Canada should be a critical ally and a critical future growth area as well on the LNG front, but it's going to be up to them to have the incentives in place.
Well, is that West Coast line that Canada has, is that oil or gas?
They have Trans Mountain, which is the oil line that was very delayed and very over budget, but has started up. So that's an oil export line. But it's Coastal Gas Link, I believe, is the name of the gas line that goes to the west. And it goes to, I think, what we used to call the Kitimat LNG project. It's LNG Canada now. And that is, it's a very near startup or in the process of starting up.
So on the natural gas side, and I'm not, I know you know these numbers, but I think it's a fairly high percentage of our electrical utilities use natural gas. Is it maybe 50%? I don't know. You know the number,
Yep.
But do you see that staying the same or growing?
So we had a big growth in natural gas for power generation in the 2000s when shale gas first started coming out. And that was the original competition with coal, where new natural gas plants were less expensive than coal, especially when you put in some of the environmental regulations around scrubbing and so forth that coal actually needs and faced. That has now been replaced with a whole bunch of solar growth. So I'd say in the last, I'm going to be off a little bit on my years, but the last decade plus, almost all of the power growth in our country has come from solar. And when you only look at the variable cost of solar, which of course is zero when the sun is shining, well, then you can understand why it gets built. But it did not reflect the decreased reliability that comes from solar. And so now we're facing this more precarious situation throughout our country, but including in Texas. I'm on the East Coast, across the nation, where so much intermittency has grown. There has not been enough care given to reliability. And that is going to be a driver of natural gas coming back. So you have solar, natural gas, and nuclear. Natural gas hits that sweet spot of being able to get built relatively quickly. There's some delays on turbines now. And with economics that can justify it starting up much sooner than nuclear, as an example.
You read a lot of articles about how much we lose in flaring, but what percentage is that really? I mean, is that really a high percentage?
It's a very small percentage, but it is one where I'm sympathetic to, let's just get rid of it as an issue. And so we can debate whether too much emphasis was put on carbon emissions and these kind of things, but that's not the same thing as saying zero emphasis should be put on it. And over the course of really the last 10 years, we've progressed so much in figuring out the technology, the measurements, and really the cost of abating methane flaring. And I will just say, from a moral perspective, the world needs energy. When you flare methane, you're depriving the world of the energy that it otherwise represents. And so I would just say, you don't have to have a strong view of climate on this. From a sort of, that is valuable resource that is just getting burned into the air. I support that we capture that methane. You can sometimes do so in a way where the revenue is greater than the cost. It takes an effort, so that's why you don't always do it immediately. But in the worst case, it might be neutral or cost a little bit. I think those efforts, we've done a good job as a country. The companies are committed to it. There's still progress to be made, and we should have as near a zero methane flaring venting as possible to ensure we can truly claim our natural gas is the cleanest in the world, which it otherwise is on track to be.
So on that same topic, we were talking about solar. Switch back. Is the return on capital of that at an effective level now, where somebody can go in and build a solar farm and the money's there?
So the rates of return are going to vary greatly. Again, the marginal economics, I mean, frankly, it's true for oil, it's true for gas, it's going to be true for solar, all these sources. There's a cost curve. There are areas where your returns are going to be better or worse. the inherent return of developing, excuse me, a solar power plant is never going to be as great as, say, finding a new oil field. But the revenues are more stable. They may even escalate. You can put debt on the security of that revenue stream. So you can get a levered return that's probably still lower than an oil field if you're a good oil company, but might make sense from a risk reward standpoint. Where I find solar interesting is from a geopolitical security standpoint. If you're a country like China or like India that is not blessed with a lot of crude oil and may not have sufficient natural gas, how do you then power yourself without being dependent on, frankly, adversaries or maybe even friendly countries from their perspective? And I think that is where solar is going to play a role. And I would encourage folks in the solar industry to stop always calling themselves, quote, climate people.
Yeah.
It's actually, I think, going to be a geopolitical security element. It can't be 100% of their power, but could it be 20 or 30% or something like that? Where I'm going to say it's not that the rate of return doesn't matter, but this can be the case where from a capital flow standpoint for a country, they may be better off kind of, apologies for the term, subsidizing that capital cost, but then where you have zero variable costs going forward and you're not dependent on an imported flow of whether it's LNG or oil or coal or something like that. So I think there's a geopolitical, strategic, and capital flow element to why solar can make sense for the developing world.
And I suppose you would say, different from fossil fuel, there's no drop off in production. Am I right? I mean,
the decline curve should be pretty flat for solar, though, solar panels do wear out. So the idea that they're renewable, again, I'm not sure that's literally true, unless you want to say manufacturing a new solar panel counts as renewable, which seems a little bit a misuse of the term. And again, how you firm it up is the big question. So even in countries that are going to grow solar for geopolitical or capital flow standpoints, whether it's LNG, and frankly, it's going to be coal in a lot of these places. So if you're an environmentalist, I always find I don't understand why there's so much focus on the US, Europe, and Canada when China is now 50% of global coal consumption. And coal is yet to peak globally. It is only growing. And India is just getting started. And never mind the rest of the developing world that hasn't even got started to get going here. So, I'm not a coal analyst by background, but I don't understand these forecasts that coal is going to peak anytime soon. Again, when so much of the world is trying to raise its living standards.
It's interesting. It's almost like I'm going to make myself feel good by doing or saying, but in reality, it's useless relative to the big world picture. I mean, I'm not saying it's not good. I'm just saying you can't make a dent in it. Am I right?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And, I try to be polite and I try not to be mean-spirited, but there's nothing I dislike more than virtue signaling, if you will. So again, we don't do the opposite, but and there is a large portion of that, I'm going to call it sustainability movement, where I'm going to call it virtue signaling. I always say, why would you attack companies in your own country? So let's just say you don't like oil and gas. If someone doesn't like it, it's totally fine. I don't have to like it. Go protest National Iranian Oil Company. Go protest Gazprom and first get their production to, quote, stay in the ground. Why would you attack companies in your own country, even if you're an environmentalist, when especially all we're doing would be exporting our production to other places that I think unquestionably, Qatar may be a little bit of exception, Saudi may be an exception, have otherwise worse environmental standards than we do, and I think all have questionable labor practices.
So I'm going to take you upstream to the electric utilities. And do you think we're coming into sort of a catastrophe relative to the grid and how much electricity we have over the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, I hope it's not going to be a catastrophe. I think we were at risk of having a really challenging situation. I think what's giving me some comfort is I think it's broadly recognized now. So, I mean, even the People's Republic of California has recognized, let's not shut in our nuclear plant. Let's figure out ways to, Diablo Canyon, let's figure out ways to keep it going. But you raise an important point. When there is an oil shortage or spike, it could be very upsetting to consumers to perhaps have to pay a lot more for gasoline. I am old enough to remember the odd and even license plates in the 70s with my parents and filling up the car. So gas lines can be quite problematic. But that's not the same thing as having your power shut off. And you can freeze to death or have other heat-related challenges without power. So we absolutely should take grid reliability very seriously. What gives me comfort, other than I think a wide swath of the population now understands this, including regulators and policymakers, including climate-oriented people, is the fact that the technology sector is fighting for the cause of reliable power. And I think it gives me a lot of hope that the most successful technology companies are getting educated on energy and are recognizing there have always been trade-offs, and we can't just pretend we're here for ESG or sustainability as the only metric. And again, I think we should take some optimism away from that.
So we're going to switch to public companies. I won't go in any detail, but I know you've compared some European countries, public companies, energy with U.S. companies. But how do you see the U.S. public companies right now in the oil and gas area? How do you see them? You think they're on point?
So we came off, by the time we got to 2020, 2021, a really tough prior decade. And when I've looked at these companies, that, as you point out, has been the bulk of my career background, a public energy equity research analyst. These cycles are 10 to 15 years of better times, 10 to 15 years of worse times. And we're coming off a decade, the 2010s, where it was pretty tough from a profitability and stock performance standpoint. In the stock market, these things went from 12 or 14% of the S&P 500 to as low as 2. They bounced to 5% at the peak of Russia, Ukraine, but now have pulled back to about 3.5% of the S&P 500. So we're closer to our lows than our highs. And I think we are on track for a better decade ahead of much better profitability than we saw 10 years ago. I think there's still questions on the part of investors that, hey, I heard a lot about peak demand. Are you sure Arjun is still going to keep growing? That's a question. I think you hear questions about, hey, if shale's maturing, are they going to have to spend a bunch of money in some other new area? So I'm going to say the peak demand question, I think, is going to fade. Where is the next great oil and gas field going to come from? That's always a question. And I'll always take I'm going to call it a normal debate about these companies as opposed to some existential risk that we're going to have net zero anytime soon. So I like the sector as in terms of, I think we're going to have good profitability going forward. I think we're going to need the oil and gas that these companies produce, but you kind of have to go company by company in terms of the specific outlooks.
Speaking about that company by company, it's interesting, and I know you commented on this, and we see it too, and we have tried to stay away from public companies like this, but there's a period there of 3 or 4 years where a number of the public U.S. oil and gas companies basically, what I'd said, succumb to current thinking and have done things that don't make any common sense whatsoever. And I wondered about their boards and their management. But we've seen a few of those, have you not?
I would say that, and I'm going to stereotype here a little bit, that effect was significantly worse amongst the largest European oils. And I've written about this, so I'll publicly say it. BP went the furthest in saying they were going to reduce their oil production by 40%, and not just do energy transition, but actually do a whole bunch of stuff where maybe some of it would have made sense, maybe some didn't, not clear what their skill set was. And I might contrast it to TotalEnergies, which I've also commented on, as having kind of a integrated gas and power strategy that seemed to fit their skill set better and didn't promise that they're going to have drastic declines in their oil production. So I will say, I will be more probably sympathetic that the U.S. industry did a better job of resisting the worst instincts that the Europeans had. Now, everyone had their ESG slide. I never liked the slide. I'm going to give one company singular credit for not doing that, and it is my friend and our new energy secretary, Chris Wright, who's Bettering Human Lives, I'm going to call the gold standard of, quote, ESG reports, where it articulated why the world uses energy, how Liberty helps companies develop that energy, and then what are the environmental and climate challenges in a very sort of realistic type of way. Every other company in the US and Europe went to, here's my ESG report that declares why I'm not as evil as you think I am. And honestly, that's an element of virtue signaling that we talked about before, that I understand why they felt pressure to do it, but do not agree with it. So,
and the secretary's report, when he was prior as being secretary, you say really laid it out better than anybody else.
I would encourage all viewers of this video to download Bettering Human Lives. It's on the Liberty Energy. It's a pressure pumping company based in Denver. I am on their board just for disclosure purposes now, but people can read the report and judge for themselves. I think it's just an outstanding report. There's a few versions of it. I think the last one was produced in 2023, and I I don't think our Secretary Wright will be able to write it again, or at least not in his current role. And I'm hoping the company will figure out a way to keep it going. So,
Well, I know, while I don't know the man, I know he got thumbs up from a lot of people I know in the industry.
I've tried to contain my excitement and super spiked about how enthusiastic I am about Secretary Wright. And frankly, Governor Burgum, or now Secretary Burgum, I don't know him personally as well, but from others that do, he was, of course, the governor of North Dakota, big Bakken oil field production there, speak very favorably about him. And I definitely don't know Secretary Lee Zeldin, who runs the EPA, but that trio, it's probably the best energy and environmental leadership we've had in this country that I can recall. And we've had some other good secretaries on both sides of the aisle, but this is the team that really knows energy. And I think it's going to stand in stark contrast to perhaps their immediate predecessors.
And a little known fact, Bergen is a pretty good basketball player.
I did not know that. So
Well,
I've played golf with the secretary. He's not a bad golfer. So with Secretary Wright. So
last couple of questions for you. First of all, I appreciate your time, and at the end of this, we'll certainly put Super Spiked on where people can know how to get to the podcast and YouTube, but which I would encourage people to do. I think they're the correct length, and they're always you're so articulate in what you've done, and it shows up with your major research analyst you've been for J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs over those many years, and you do it well. But here's my question.
Thank you, sir. That is very kind of you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
A lot of individuals watch this show, and they're investors, and I'm not asking to name companies. I'm just asking what would your general advice be to an individual investor about owning energy over the next decade, the next 10 years? Would it be good? Would it be what would you just a general advice be to them?
I mean, I think general advice, and this is something I'm doing myself, is I think it is an important component to the portfolio. I think the things you're going to have to believe to want to invest in energy is the fact that the world will always prioritize economic and therefore energy development. They go hand in hand. If your economy grows, you use more energy, and that we're going to need essentially all sources. We're going to need the old stuff and we're going to need the new stuff. And then I think the question is, well, let's just say the European oils have really underperformed the US. You'd have to then make a call that have the boards and managements change to where they might have a better outlook. Or perhaps if they're less exposed to shale, do you think shale is maturing and perhaps international exploration comes back? Do we think Canada as a country is going to figure out a way to incentivize, quote, drill baby drill and build baby bill? And might that not portend well for Canadian oils? They've otherwise had very competitive profitability. And I've written a lot about I think how underappreciated the Canadian oil and gas industry is. I think with new energies, what of the new stuff might scale? Clearly, they're all starting from a small base. So if you can find a company, we've seen companies like GE Vernova and others who build power turbines and so forth. Their equities have done very well. I don't know if they're overvalued now or not. Other experts should weigh in on that. But there's so many different areas to look. The merchant power producers, Vistra, Talon, and Constellation, in the last year and a half, have actually outperformed NVIDIA, apparently the greatest company on earth, right? And so how crazy is that? And so I've had the good fortune to interact with Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z as they're called, and it's Mark Andreessen who has the famous line, software is going to eat the world. It's been a phenomenal theme. He's been 100% right about it. But my add-on to that is, yes, software is eating the world, but all software requires hardware, and all hardware requires power. And that is going to be that mix of sort of tech with energy. Energy is a commodity business. You know, it's not the same thing as discovering a GPU chip that everyone needs, but I think there's a role in the portfolio. It's an inflation hedge. And there are companies, and what I focus on in my work is, which are the companies that can consistently generate double-digit to mid-teens returns on capital, irrespective of the cycle. And in our down periods, there's still cost of capital return. And in the good periods, they're 20, 25% return on capital. You can use any profitability metric you prefer. And so if you're an individual investor, I always recommend getting some counsel on this. I do a mix of public and private equity investing for these kind of topics. I am not a power and utility person by background. It's where I'm spending most of my time trying to ramp up. But there are frankly a lot of good private equity and other folks who know that space very well that at Veriton and myself personally are trying to get to know better.
And one follow-up question on that, two individuals too, but on the solar side, do on the public companies, do you see it in the equipment manufacturers or the producers? Where do you see an individual should be looking at?
I'm gonna have to say that that is an especially tricky space. So unlike a lot of the new energy companies that were started in the last 4 or 5 years, all of which coincidentally or otherwise peaked with President Biden's inauguration, and it's a little known fact, or at least it's underappreciated, quote, new energies did really well in Trump 1 and really poorly during Biden's only term. And for oil and gas, it was actually the opposite. It did terrible under Trump 1 and did much better under Biden. Now, a lot of that's coincidence, but I will point that out. I think when you look at the publicly traded solar companies, as you mentioned, I worked at Goldman Sachs. My former colleague, Brian Lee, is a terrific residential solar analyst, but you got to understand the cycles. They're very volatile companies. I would definitely defer to others deep in the space. China dominates a lot of these, quote, new energy areas. I'm going to say that's for geopolitical purposes as opposed to climate. And that can make it tricky if you're a US or European company in this realm. So I apologize for not fully answering this. I'm going to have to defer to the experts and just tell people you do need to be more careful in those spaces. Not that you shouldn't be careful elsewhere, but it's especially tricky with solar. So.
Well, listen, Arjun, I want to thank you for being with us today. I know you have a busy schedule. You do a lot of things, but I've found this so interesting to visit with you on this. And I would hope that you would consider coming back in a year or so and we'll visit again on it.
I appreciate your great questions. This has been a real pleasure to do this. And I love talking about energy. So I'm always able to carve out time to help educate the world on why energy is such an important area. You don't have to love it, but you should understand it and you should get the facts yourself. Doesn't mean what I'm saying is correct. Get a range of views, but I'm so blessed to have been an energy equity research analyst for my 33-year career so far in counting. And I thank you for having me on today.
Thanks a lot. We'll see you next year. Hello, everyone. I just want to say, if you like this video and you want to see more of this type of information, because we really try to get the information that you don't see from anybody else, then be sure and click on subscribe and you'll see more of what we do here at Oxbow.